Mercedes just dominated the Chinese Grand Prix. A perfect weekend. Total control. No weaknesses. And now, the FIA might take it all away. Because what they found after Shanghai isn't just suspicious. It could be illegal. We're talking about a hidden advantage in energy deployment. Something no other team can match. Something that made Mercedes untouchable on every straight. And now, every rival is asking the same question. How are they doing it? And more importantly, did they go too far? Because if the FIA confirms this, Mercedes doesn't just lose performance. They lose everything. Stay here, because the detail that exposes this whole situation comes later. And you do not want to miss it. Subscribe now. Right after Shanghai, something didn't feel normal. Not because Mercedes won, but because of how easily they did it. From the very first session, the pattern was already there. Russell at the top, Antonelli right next to him. Lap after lap, session after session. No fluctuation. No real challenge. Just consistent dominance. And that kind of consistency is rare, even for top teams. Because usually, there's always something. Tire degradation. Traffic. Energy drop at the end of the straight. But Mercedes had none of that. The car looked planted. Stable in high-speed corners. Aggressive on entry. Calm on exit. And then came the straights. That's where things started to look different. Not just fast, but sustained. The W17 didn't lose power halfway down the straight. It didn't fade near the braking zone. It just kept going. Full deployment. Every lap. Like the battery never ran out. And that's where engineers from other teams started noticing something unusual. Because in this era of Formula One, energy is everything. You can't just push endlessly. There are limits. Strict ones. And yet, Mercedes looked like they weren't hitting them. Or at least, not in the way everyone else was. We'll come back to why that matters. Because at this point, it still looked like technical excellence. Perfect execution. Nothing more. But then the data started circulating. Sector times. Speed traces. Deployment curves. And suddenly, the gap wasn't just visible on track. It was measurable. And uncomfortable. Because Ferrari, for example, wasn't slow. Not at all. In fact, through medium speed corners, they were right there. Sometimes even better. Better traction. Better rotation. Cleaner exits. But every time they reached the straight, they lost it. Again. And again. And again. Not by a huge margin. But enough. Always enough. And that's what made it dangerous. Because it wasn't a one-time advantage. It was repeatable. Predictable. Reliable. And in Formula One, if something is always working perfectly, people start asking why. Now here's where it gets more interesting. Because internally, Mercedes knew exactly what they had. A car that wasn't just fast, but complete, balanced, efficient, and incredibly forgiving. Even when things weren't perfect. Even when Russell had that electronic issue in qualifying, the car still delivered. Still fast enough for the front row. That shouldn't happen. Not at this level. Not with that kind of problem. But it did. And that detail stayed quiet. At least for a few hours. Because what looked like a small glitch was actually the first real sign that the system behind this car might be more complex than anyone expected. And maybe, pushing limits no one else has figured out yet. Or no one else is willing to risk. And this is where the tension starts to build. Because dominance alone doesn't trigger investigations. But dominance without visible weakness? That's different. That's when rivals start looking closer. That's when data gets analyzed. That's when questions turn into pressure. And right now, that pressure is building. Fast. Because what Mercedes showed in China wasn't just performance. It was control. And control like that always comes with a cost. We just don't know yet what that cost will be. And this is where everything starts to escalate. Because what happened after the race didn't happen on track. It happened behind closed doors. In engineering rooms. In data reports. In conversations that never reached the broadcast. Multiple teams began comparing numbers. Not guesses. Not opinions. Real telemetry. Speed traces from the main straight. Energy deployment graphs. Recovery phases under braking. And something didn't match. Because Mercedes wasn't just faster at one point. They were faster everywhere it mattered. Entry. Mid-corner. Exit. And then, maximum deployment again. No compromise. No trade-off. That's the key. Because every other team has to choose. You either defend early in the straight, or attack at the end. You manage energy, or you spend it. You never get both. But Mercedes looked like they had both. Every single lap. And that's when the questions changed. This was no longer about setup. No longer about driver performance. This became a technical question. A very specific one. How is the energy being deployed? And how is it lasting that long? Because according to regulations, there is a limit to how much energy can be released per lap. A hard limit. Non-negotiable. And yet, the behavior of the W17 suggested something else. Not necessarily breaking the rules, but stretching them. Right to the edge. Maybe even redefining how those rules are interpreted. And that's where the FIA steps in. Not with accusations, but with interest. And interest from the FIA is never casual. Because once they start asking, they don't stop halfway. They go deep. Software, control units, energy flow, deployment timing, everything. And here's where things get uncomfortable for Mercedes. Because if their advantage comes from a very specific way of managing energy, a method that sits in a gray area, then all it takes is one clarification, one technical directive, and suddenly, that advantage disappears. Not gradually, instantly. And here's the part that makes this even more intense. Mercedes knows this. They know exactly how fine that line is. Because teams at this level don't guess. They calculate. They push until the limit and then hold it there. But when the governing body starts looking closer, that limit can move. And if it moves, you don't adapt over a season. You lose performance overnight. Now think about what that means. A car that just dominated an entire weekend, a car that looked unbeatable, could arrive at the next race and feel completely different. Slower on the straights, more vulnerable in defense, easier to attack. And suddenly, Ferrari doesn't look so far behind anymore. But there's another layer. And almost nobody is talking about it yet. Because while all of this is happening externally, Mercedes is dealing with something internally. 2 drivers, 2 winners, 1 team. Antonelli just proved he can lead. Russell just proved he won't step aside. And when performance is equal, tension grows. Now add uncertainty. Add a possible regulation change. Add pressure from rivals. And what you get is a situation that can spiral very quickly. Because if Mercedes loses even a fraction of that advantage, the fight won't just be against Ferrari. It will be inside the garage. And that's when mistakes happen. Strategy errors. Communication breakdowns. Risky decisions. All under pressure. All amplified. So now the situation is no longer simple. This is not just about whether Mercedes is legal, or whether they are fast. This is about timing. Because right now, they are at their peak. Everything works. Everything aligns. But the FIA is watching. The rivals are watching. And the smallest change could shift the entire balance of the championship. And the most dangerous part is that we still don't know exactly what the FIA has found. But we do know this. They wouldn't be looking if there wasn't something worth investigating. And now, we reach the part nobody inside Formula One wants to say too loudly. Because this is no longer just suspicion. This is where patterns start turning into evidence. After China, the FIA didn't just collect data. They started comparing it against expectations. What should happen? What normally happens? And what Mercedes was actually doing. And the difference is where everything begins to break. Because under normal conditions, energy deployment follows a curve. You release power early, and you lose it later. Or you save early, and deploy at the end. There is always a compromise. Always a limitation. But Mercedes showed something else entirely. A deployment curve that looked flat, stable, controlled from start to finish. No visible drop. No clipping near the braking zone. Just continuous output. And that should not be possible under standard behavior. Now here's where it gets even more precise. Because the FIA doesn't just look at speed. They look at how energy is harvested. Under braking. Through corner phases. Micro recovery zones that most people never notice. And what they found was efficiency. Extreme efficiency. Almost perfect conversion of braking into usable energy. And then, perfect timing of when that energy gets released. Not wasted. Not delayed. Not spiking. Just optimized. And that word, optimized, is exactly where the danger is. Because optimization has a limit. A regulatory limit. And once you cross it, even by interpretation, you're no longer innovating. You're exploiting. And that's the line the FIA is now trying to define. But here's the problem. That line is not always clear. Sometimes, it depends on how the system behaves over time. Not just in one lap, but across an entire stint. Across an entire race. And in China, Mercedes never dropped off. Not once. While others managed. While others conserved. While others struggled with degradation and energy balance, Mercedes remained constant. And that consistency is what triggered the deeper investigation. Now imagine being inside that FIA room, looking at data, comparing traces, seeing one car behave differently every single lap. At first, you ask questions. Then you ask for clarification. Then you start looking for explanations that fit the rules. And if they don't fit cleanly, that's when things escalate. Because at that point, it's no longer about curiosity. It's about control. And Formula One cannot allow a system that redefines the limits without oversight. So now, the FIA is not just observing. They're preparing possible clarifications, possible directives, possible changes that could redefine how energy systems are allowed to operate. And here's the part that changes everything. These directives don't need to prove cheating. They don't need to accuse. They just need to redefine the interpretation. And overnight, what was legal becomes restricted. What was an advantage becomes unavailable. And the teams affected have no time to react. Now think about Mercedes again. A car built around this strength. A system that clearly relies on this efficiency. If that gets limited, you're not just losing speed. You're losing identity. Because this isn't a small upgrade. This is the core of their performance. And removing that is like removing the foundation of everything we saw in China. And suddenly, that dominant car becomes vulnerable. But here's where the tension reaches another level. Because Mercedes knows this is coming. They've seen it before. Every dominant team has. The moment you stand too far ahead, the spotlight turns into pressure. The pressure turns into regulation. And regulation turns into limitation. So now they face a choice. Defend their system. Prove it's within the rules. Fight the interpretation. Or quietly prepare for a scenario where they have to change everything. And none of those options are comfortable. Because while they're dealing with this, the season is moving. The championship is building. Points are being scored. And behind them, Ferrari is waiting. Closer than it looks. Closer than the results suggest. And if Mercedes loses even a fraction of that energy advantage, Ferrari won't need a miracle. They'll just need an opportunity. And that opportunity might be coming sooner than anyone expected. Because the FIA doesn't delay when something affects competitive balance. They act. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes suddenly. But always decisively. And when they do, the entire grid feels it. So now everything comes down to one moment. One decision. One interpretation that could redefine the season. And the most important detail? The one that explains exactly what Mercedes might be doing differently. Is still hidden. But once it comes out, it changes everything.